August 9th, 1945. 11:02 a.m. A city of 240,000 people going about their Thursday morning. Children playing, mothers preparing lunch, workers at their stations. And then, in a single blinding flash, everything changed. Today, I want to share with you something different. Not a history lesson from textbooks, not statistics or strategic analysis, but the actual memories of children who were there, kids who survived one of only 2 atomic bombs ever used in warfare. What was it like to be a child in Nagasaki that day? Let me tell you their stories. Before we dive into these personal accounts, we need to understand where Nagasaki was in the summer of 1945. The war had been grinding on for years. For Japanese children, this was all they really knew. Rationing was normal. Air raid drills were routine. Many had fathers, brothers, or uncles away fighting. Nagasaki itself was different from other Japanese cities. It had always been a bit of an outsider. For centuries, it was Japan's only window to the Western world during the isolation period. The city had a significant Christian population, unusual for Japan. There was diversity here, international influence, a port city mentality. By August 1945, the city had already been touched by war. There had been conventional bombing raids. Food was scarce. Families were struggling. But Nagasaki hadn't experienced the massive firebombing that destroyed Tokyo and other cities. Some residents wondered why. Were they being spared? Was their city not considered important enough? The truth was far more chilling, though nobody knew it yet. Nagasaki was on a list, a short list. 3 days earlier, on August 6th, Hiroshima had been destroyed by something the Americans called an atomic bomb. News was spreading, but information was fragmentary, confusing. The government wasn't being transparent about what had happened. In Nagasaki, people heard rumors. Some fantastical new weapon, massive destruction, but the details were unclear. Life continued. Parents still sent their children to school. Workers still went to the Mitsubishi factories. The routines of daily life persisted because, well, what else could people do? On the morning of August 9th, the weather was hot and humid. Typical summer weather. Some clouds in the sky. Children across Nagasaki were doing what children do. They had no idea they were living the last moments of the world as they knew it. Let me introduce you to some of these children. These are real people whose testimonies were recorded in the decades after the bombing. There was Sachiko, 9 years old, who lived about 2 kilometers from what would become Ground Zero. That morning, she was helping her mother in their small garden, picking eggplants. Her father worked at the Mitsubishi steelworks. Her older brother had been drafted. Sumiteru was 12, already working in a factory as part of the student mobilization program. Japan had pulled children out of school to work in war industries. He was at the Mitsubishi arms factory that morning, doing his assigned tasks with other boys his age. Emiko was only 6. She was at home with her grandmother while her mother had gone to get their rice ration. Emiko was playing with a small doll her father had made before he left for the war. Yoshiro was 8, and that morning he was actually happy. School had been cancelled again, and he was playing in the street with friends, kicking around a ball made of rags and string. These were ordinary children. Think about 8-year-olds, you know. Their concerns were simple. Would there be enough to eat? Could they play with friends? When would their fathers come home? Around 7:50 that morning, air raid sirens went off. This happened sometimes. American B-29s had been spotted. People went to shelters or stayed alert, but then the all clear sounded. The planes had left the area. People returned to their activities. The danger had passed, except it hadn't. What people didn't know was that the initial planes were weather reconnaissance. They were checking conditions, and they sent back a message. Nagasaki was visible enough. The mission could proceed. A B-29 called Boxcar was approaching, carrying a plutonium bomb nicknamed Fat Man. The original target had actually been Kokura, another city. but Kokura was obscured by clouds and smoke. After 3 passes, the crew diverted to their secondary target, Nagasaki. By this random chance of weather and smoke, Nagasaki's fate was sealed, and Kokura was spared. Around 11 a.m., some people noticed planes again, but there had been an all-clear earlier. Most people didn't take cover. There were only 3 planes, someone said. Just a reconnaissance flight. Nothing to worry about. Sachiko was still in the garden with her mother. Sumiteru was at his work station in the factory. Emiko was playing on the floor of her house. Yoshiro had gone inside for a drink of water. The time was 11:01 a.m., 1 minute left. At 11:02 a.m., Fat Man detonated 1,650 feet above the Urakami Valley, slightly off target from the intended aiming point. The children who survived all described the same thing first: the light. Not sound. Light. A flash so bright, so overwhelming that it seemed to erase the world. Sachiko described it as brighter than 1,000 suns, though she'd never read that phrase. She said the entire sky turned white, then orange, then colors she couldn't name. She was facing away from the blast, bent over the eggplants. That simple fact saved her vision. Children who were looking in the direction of the explosion were instantly blinded, many permanently. The light was so intense that it burned shadows onto walls and streets. People's shadows were permanently seared into concrete. In one of history's most haunting images, the shadow of a man climbing a ladder was imprinted on the side of a gas storage tank. He vanished, but his shadow remained. For children closer to the hypocenter, there was no time to process what was happening. The thermal radiation traveled at the speed of light. Temperatures at ground level directly under the burst reached thousands of degrees. A child playing in a street simply ceased to exist. There one moment, gone the next. No body to recover. Just ash. But let's stay with those who survived to tell their stories. After the flash came the sound and the shockwave, but these didn't arrive together because light travels faster than sound. There was this strange, suspended moment. Blinding light. Silence. And then, the sound was beyond description. Every survivor struggles to put it into words. It wasn't just loud. It was a physical force, a roar that came from everywhere at once. The air itself seemed to be screaming. Sumiteru, at the factory, said the world turned white and then he was flying. Actually flying through the air. The entire building was collapsing around him and he was being hurled through space like he weighed nothing. The shockwave traveled outward at over 700 miles per hour. It shattered every window in the city, flattened thousands of buildings, the Mitsubishi factories, massive industrial complexes of steel and concrete, crumbled like sandcastles. Yoshiro, who had just stepped inside his house for water, was thrown across the room. The walls came down on top of him. Everything went dark. He was buried in debris, unable to see, barely able to breathe. For children further from the center, the experience was surreal. Emiko's grandmother threw herself on top of the little girl when the flash came. Their house, a traditional wooden structure, was blown apart. Emiko found herself lying in the open air, covered by her grandmother's body, surrounded by splinters of what had been their home moments before. The sound echoed off the mountains surrounding Nagasaki, rolling back and forth, making it seem like the explosion was happening again and again. And then came the wind. The blast created a vacuum, and air rushed back in toward ground zero in a reverse shock wave. Fires were starting everywhere. The heat from the blast had ignited anything flammable, but this reverse wind spread the flames outward, creating thousands of individual fires that would soon merge into a firestorm. All of this happened in seconds. Children went from playing, working, doing ordinary things, to being in the middle of hell on earth. Just like that. No warning. No time to prepare. Sachiko stood up, her ears ringing, blood running from cuts she didn't remember getting. The eggplant garden was gone. The house behind her was leaning at an impossible angle, and her mother was screaming a name, her little brother's name. He'd been inside. What happens in a child's mind when their entire world is destroyed in an instant? The testimonies from Nagasaki's children reveal something you might not expect. Many of them didn't understand what had happened. Their brains couldn't process it. Some thought an earthquake had occurred. Others believed a bomb had hit directly on their house. The concept of a single bomb destroying an entire city was beyond their comprehension. Yoshiro, trapped under the rubble of his house, thought he was going to die. He was 8 years old. He tried to call for his mother, but dust filled his mouth. He couldn't see anything, couldn't move. The weight on top of him was crushing. He did what children do. He started to cry. Then he heard voices. Neighbors, themselves injured, were digging people out. Someone found him, pulled away enough debris that he could move. He crawled out into daylight. But it wasn't daylight, not really. The sky had turned dark. Ash and smoke blocked the sun. It looked like twilight at 11 in the morning. And everywhere he looked, there was destruction. Yoshiro's street was gone. The houses had been wooden, typical of Japanese cities at the time. They'd been obliterated. Fires were starting in the wreckage. People were emerging from the ruins, bleeding, burned, stumbling in shock. He looked for his mother, started calling for her. This scene was repeating across the city. Children crying for parents, parents screaming for children. The sounds of thousands of people in pain, in terror, in confusion. Sachiko's mother was digging through what remained of their house with bare hands, throwing aside broken wood and tiles, calling for Sachiko's little brother. Sachiko tried to help, but she was small and the debris was heavy. They found him. He was alive. Trapped, terrified, but alive. They pulled him out, but their father was at the Mitsubishi plant, much closer to the explosion center. They had no idea if he'd survived. At the factory where Sumiteru worked, the scene was catastrophic. The buildings had collapsed. Many workers were dead, crushed instantly. Others were trapped in the wreckage, some with terrible injuries. Sumiteru had been thrown clear of the collapsing structure by pure chance. He was hurt, bleeding from cuts, his ears ringing so loud he could barely hear. But he could walk. Around him, men and boys were screaming. Some were on fire, others were trying to free people trapped in the twisted metal and concrete. And then Sumiteru saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A boy he worked with, maybe 13 years old, was trapped under a huge steel beam. The boy was conscious, begging for help, but the beam was too heavy. It would take many men with proper equipment to move it, and the fires were spreading. The men tried, they really did, but the beam wouldn't budge. The flames were getting closer. The heat was becoming unbearable. They had to leave him. Sumiteru heard that boy screaming as they ran. He heard him until they got far enough away that the sound of the fires drowned everything else out. He was 12 years old. Remember, these children had already lived through years of war. They'd experienced air raids, rationing, fear, and loss. They were tougher than most kids today need to be. But nothing prepared them for this. The scale of destruction was incomprehensible. Nagasaki had been a city of neighborhoods and communities. Now entire districts had simply vanished. Landmarks that children used to navigate were gone. Streets were unrecognizable, filled with rubble. Children were separated from parents in the chaos. The injured were everywhere. Some people were walking around with horrific burns, their skin hanging in strips. Others were clearly dying but still moving, still trying to find safety or find loved ones. And the children saw all of this. Emiko, only 6 years old, was being carried by her grandmother, who was herself injured. They were trying to get to the river. Everyone had the same idea: get to water, escape the fires. But the rivers of Nagasaki would become scenes of horror themselves. By early afternoon, the individual fires had merged into a firestorm. The intense heat created its own weather system, generating winds that fed the flames. Children who had survived the initial blast now faced a new threat: being burned alive. Yoshiro had found his mother. She was injured, one arm badly burned, but alive. Together, they were trying to move away from the flames, but the fire seemed to be everywhere, spreading faster than people could run. The heat was incredible. Even blocks away from the flames, the air was scorching. It hurt to breathe. They joined a stream of people, thousands of injured and terrified civilians, all moving away from the burning city center. Children were being carried. Others limped along, bleeding, burned. Many were naked, or nearly so. The flash of heat had burned clothing right off people's bodies. Children walked in shock, unaware of their nakedness, focused only on survival. Sachiko's family was also fleeing. Her father still hadn't appeared. Her mother made the hardest decision of her life. She had to get the children to safety. She couldn't stay and search for her husband. They moved toward the river with hundreds of others. The rivers that ran through Nagasaki seemed like salvation. Water meant relief from the heat, protection from the fires. People threw themselves into the rivers, but the rivers became mass graves. Many people were too injured to swim. They waded in, seeking relief from their burns, and drowned. Others died in the water from their injuries. The rivers filled with bodies. Children who could swim tried to help younger siblings or friends who couldn't. Some succeeded. Many didn't. Emiko's grandmother was weakening. The older woman had been injured protecting her granddaughter, and she'd lost blood. They reached the river, and the grandmother sat down at the water's edge, telling Emiko to wet her face, to drink. The little girl did. The water was murky, but it was cool. When she turned around, her grandmother had died. Emiko was 6 years old, alone in the middle of catastrophe, next to the body of her grandmother. Then the rain started. About 30 minutes after the explosion, large drops of rain began to fall. But this wasn't normal rain. It was black, thick, dark, oily rain that stained everything it touched. This was the black rain that many survivors remember vividly. It was caused by the nuclear cloud mixing with smoke, dust, and water vapor. The drops were filled with radioactive particles, carbon from the fires, and ash. Children, desperately thirsty, opened their mouths to the rain. They didn't know they were swallowing radiation. Yoshiro remembers the black rain staining his skin, making him look like he was covered in oil. It had a strange smell. Chemical. Wrong. The rain was heavy in some areas, turning the ash-covered ground into a dark mud. Children slipped and fell in it, coating themselves in the radioactive sludge. We know now that this black rain caused long-term health effects. Cancer, radiation sickness. But in that moment, people were just grateful for water, for something to cool their burned skin. As the afternoon wore on, the scope of the disaster became clearer. This wasn't just an attack on a military target. This was the destruction of an entire city. Medical facilities were overwhelmed or destroyed. Doctors and nurses were dead or injured. There weren't enough supplies to treat even a fraction of the wounded. Children with terrible injuries had no one to help them. Parents with medical training did what they could with no equipment, no medicine, no antiseptics. Sumiteru spent the afternoon helping pull survivors from wreckage. He was just a boy, but everyone who could help was helping. He saw things no child should see. People burned beyond recognition. Children calling for parents who were already dead. At some point, he became numb to it. Had to. The horror was too great to process continuously. This is something many child survivors talk about. At some point during that day, they stopped feeling, stopped crying. They just moved mechanically, doing what needed to be done. Psychologists would later recognize this as dissociation, the mind's way of protecting itself from overwhelming trauma. But in the moment, these children just knew they had to keep moving, keep surviving, keep helping where they could. As darkness fell on August 9th, Nagasaki was burning. The firestorm illuminated the night sky with an orange glow. Smoke rose in massive columns. The city looked like a vision of hell. Children faced their first night in this new reality. Many were separated from their families, alone or with strangers. Others had watched family members die during the day. Some still clung to hope that missing parents or siblings were alive somewhere in the chaos. Sachiko's family had made it to a hillside area outside the main destruction zone. Her father had not appeared. Her mother was trying to comfort her younger brother, who wouldn't stop crying. Sachiko sat apart from them, staring at the burning city. She was 9 years old, and she understood that everything had changed. Even if her father was alive, even if they all survived, nothing would ever be the same. That's a heavy realization for an adult, let alone a child. Yoshiro and his mother found shelter in a partially collapsed building with dozens of other survivors. His mother's burns needed treatment, but there was no treatment available. They had no food, no clean water, just a roof overhead, partially intact. Children were crying throughout the night. Injured people were moaning in pain. The smell was terrible. Burned flesh, smoke, death. Yoshiro tried to sleep but couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the flash again, felt the building collapsing, heard the screams. This would be the beginning of nightmares that would last for years. Emiko had been found by a neighbor who recognized her. This woman, herself injured, had gathered several children whose parents were missing. They huddled together in the ruins of a stone building. Emiko kept asking for her grandmother, not understanding that she wasn't coming back. The neighbor woman finally told her gently that her grandmother had died, that she'd gone to be with the ancestors. The little girl cried herself into exhausted sleep. Sumiteru spent the night at a designated aid station that had been set up in an undamaged school building far from the hypocenter. Hundreds of injured people were there, lying on the floors, outside in the yard, anywhere there was space. A handful of medical personnel were doing their best, but it was hopeless. Too many injured, too few supplies. Sumiteru watched doctors and nurses making impossible decisions about who to treat, who to give the limited pain medication to. They prioritized those who might survive. Those who were too far gone received comfort if there was time, or nothing at all if there wasn't. Children with fatal injuries died during the night, calling for parents who were likely already dead themselves. This was the reality of the first night after the atomic bomb, but something else was happening too. Something that wouldn't become apparent for days or weeks. Radiation poisoning. The children and adults who survived the blast and the fires had been exposed to massive amounts of radiation. Some were already showing symptoms. Nausea, fatigue, strange burns that didn't match fire burns. But most symptoms would come later. The people taking shelter, helping each other, trying to survive that first terrible night, had no idea that an invisible threat was inside them, damaging their cells, their DNA, their futures. Children who seemed fine, who had escaped with only minor injuries, would fall sick in the coming weeks. Their hair would fall out. They'd develop strange purple spots on their skin. They'd bleed from their gums, their noses. Many would die from this radiation sickness without ever understanding what was killing them. But that night, there was only the immediate horror to deal with. The fires, the injuries, the missing family members. Parents who had survived spent the night searching for children. Children who were alone spent it crying for parents. And those who had lost everything sat in numb shock, trying to understand how the world had ended. August 10th dawned on a ruined city. In daylight, the full scale of destruction became visible. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to ash and rubble. The Urakami Valley, where the bomb had exploded, was flattened. Nothing stood higher than a few feet in a huge radius around Ground Zero. Children emerged from wherever they'd sheltered to see a landscape that looked alien. The city they'd known was gone. Yoshiro's mother's burns had gotten worse overnight. The skin was blistering, peeling. She was in terrible pain but trying to hide it from her son. They needed food and water. Yoshiro, at 8 years old, went out to look for supplies. What he found was indescribable. Bodies everywhere. Some recognizable as human, others burned beyond identification. The smell in the August heat was overwhelming. He saw other children, alone, wandering in shock. Some were calling for parents, others just walked aimlessly, their eyes empty. There was a little girl, maybe 5 years old, sitting next to what appeared to be her mother's body. The child was stroking the woman's hair, talking to her, but the woman was clearly dead. Yoshiro wanted to help her, but what could he do? He was a child himself, and his own mother needed him. This was one of the cruelest aspects of the aftermath. There were so many people who needed help that it was impossible to help everyone. Children had to make adult decisions about who to help and who to pass by. Sachiko's father appeared on the second day. He'd been at the Mitsubishi plant when the bomb hit. By all odds, he should have been dead. But he'd been in a section of the building that had some shielding, and he'd survived the initial blast. He was badly injured. Burns covered his back and arms. He'd inhaled smoke and was coughing constantly. But he was alive. The family reunion was tearful, joyful, and heartbreaking all at once. They'd survived together, but they'd lost everything else. Their home was destroyed. Their possessions were gone. The father couldn't work in his condition, but they were together. That's what mattered to Sachiko. Her family was intact. Many children around her had lost parents, siblings, everyone. She felt guilty for her good fortune. Emiko was taken in by relatives who came from outside Nagasaki, searching for family. Her mother was eventually found, injured but alive. But her grandmother was gone, and her father's fate was unknown. It would be months before they learned he'd died in the war weeks earlier. The little girl had lost her grandmother in the bombing and her father in the war, though she didn't know about her father yet. At 6, she understood loss, but not the permanence of it. She kept expecting her grandmother to appear, to pick her up, to tell her everything was okay. Sumiteru's family situation was complicated. His parents had both died in the bombing. His older sister survived but was severely injured. At 12, he was suddenly responsible for taking care of her. There were thousands of orphans created by the Nagasaki bombing. Children who'd lost one or both parents. Some were taken in by relatives, others ended up in orphanages. Some simply lived on the streets, scavenging to survive. The Japanese government was overwhelmed. The entire country was in chaos. The war was ending. Japan would surrender on August 15th. But that didn't immediately make life better for survivors. Relief efforts began, but they were inadequate. Food was scarce across Japan, not just in Nagasaki. Medical supplies were limited. Aid workers did their best, but the scale of the disaster was beyond their capacity to address. Children stood in long lines for food rations, a bowl of rice, some soup, whatever was available. Many children were too traumatized to eat. They'd lost their appetite along with everything else. The psychological impact was profound and immediate. Children stopped speaking. They'd wake screaming from nightmares. Some refused to go inside buildings, terrified of being trapped if another bomb fell. Parents had no idea how to help. They were traumatized themselves, and then the radiation sickness began to manifest. About a week after the bombing, people who had seemed fine started getting sick. Children who'd escaped major injuries suddenly developed fevers, nausea, diarrhea. Their hair fell out in clumps. Purple spots appeared on their skin, subcutaneous bleeding caused by radiation destroying their bone marrow. They bled from their gums when they brushed their teeth, from their noses, internally. And doctors didn't know how to treat them. This was a new kind of sickness. Nobody understood radiation poisoning. There was no treatment protocol, no medicine that helped. Children died weeks after the bombing from this mysterious illness, while their parents watched helplessly. Yoshiro's mother developed these symptoms. She'd been exposed to a significant amount of radiation. Her burns weren't healing properly. Then her hair started falling out. Yoshiro watched his mother deteriorate day by day. She tried to hide how sick she was, but he could see it. He was 8 years old, taking care of his mother, watching her die slowly. She lasted 3 weeks before the radiation sickness killed her. Yoshiro became an orphan on August 30th. This pattern repeated thousands of times. The bomb kept killing long after the explosion and fires had ended. The children who survived the immediate aftermath and the radiation sickness faced a lifetime of consequences. Let's talk about what that meant. First, there were the physical scars. Burns left permanent marks. Children grew up with keloid scars covering their bodies. In Japanese culture, which valued physical appearance and perfection, these scars carried social stigma. Girls especially faced discrimination. Burn scars on the face meant difficulty finding marriage partners later. Some survivors were rejected by potential spouses' families because of their scars or their exposure to radiation. Then there were the ongoing health problems. Children exposed to radiation faced higher rates of cancer throughout their lives. Leukemia, thyroid cancer, breast cancer, lung cancer. The rates were significantly elevated among survivors. Many developed these cancers as teenagers or young adults. Children who'd survived the bomb died of its effects decades later. Women who'd been exposed as children faced complications with pregnancy. Higher rates of miscarriage, worries about birth defects, though the actual rate of genetic damage wasn't as high as initially feared. But the psychological scars might have been the deepest. Sachiko, who survived with her family intact, still struggled her entire life with what she witnessed that day. Nightmares, anxiety, depression, what we'd now recognize as PTSD. She described feeling guilty for surviving when so many died. Guilty that her family stayed together when others were torn apart. This survivor's guilt was common among Nagasaki's children. Many survivors didn't talk about their experiences for years or even decades. The trauma was too deep, the memories too painful. Some were ashamed. In post-war Japan, there was a cultural tendency to move forward, to rebuild, to not dwell on suffering. Talking about trauma wasn't encouraged. Additionally, survivors faced discrimination. They were called hibakusha, bomb-affected people. Some Japanese people feared they were contaminated, radioactive, that their children would be deformed. Children who survived the bomb often hid their survivor status when they grew up. They wouldn't tell potential employers or marriage partners about their exposure. This secrecy added to their psychological burden. Carrying trauma you can't talk about is especially damaging. Sumiteru, who became responsible for his injured sister at 12, grew up fast. Too fast. He worked odd jobs, did whatever he could to support them both. He never had a normal childhood or adolescence. His sister struggled with her injuries and eventually died young from cancer related to radiation exposure. Sumiteru was left alone, the last of his immediate family. He became an advocate for survivors later in life, but that came only after decades of silence about his experiences. Emiko grew up without clear memories of what happened. She was so young when the bomb fell that her recollections were fragmentary. Flashes of light, her grandmother's face, the black rain. But the trauma affected her anyway. She had separation anxiety as a child, couldn't bear to be away from her mother, had panic attacks when she heard loud noises. Her mother never remarried, never really recovered from losing her husband and her mother. The two of them lived a quiet, isolated life. This isolation was common among survivor families. The trauma made normal social interaction difficult. And then there was the anger. As these children grew into teenagers and adults, many felt profound anger at what had been done to them. Anger at the Americans who dropped the bomb. Anger at the Japanese government for continuing a war that led to such devastation. Anger at the world for allowing nuclear weapons to exist. Some channeled this anger into activism, becoming voices for peace and nuclear disarmament. Others let it consume them, living bitter lives focused on their suffering. And some simply tried to forget, to build new lives separate from their identity as survivors. But forgetting was impossible. The scars were too visible, the health problems too persistent, the memories too vivid. Yoshiro, who lost his mother to radiation sickness, ended up in an orphanage. He was one of hundreds of children in similar situations. Life in these orphanages was hard. Resources were scarce. Emotional support was minimal. Children were expected to be tough, to overcome, to not complain. Yoshiro learned to bury his feelings. He focused on surviving, on getting through each day. This emotional suppression served him in the short term but caused problems later in life. He struggled with relationships, with trusting people, with expressing emotion. The trauma of losing everything at 8 years old shaped every aspect of his adult personality. Many child survivors reported similar struggles. Difficulty forming close relationships, trust issues, emotional numbness, or conversely, explosive emotions. The trauma wasn't something they could leave behind. It was woven into who they were. The children of Nagasaki grew up in a Japan that was radically different from the one they'd known before August 9th, 1945. The war ended 6 days after the bombing. Japan was occupied by American forces. The entire society was being rebuilt, restructured, reimagined. For children who'd experienced the bomb, this added to their confusion and trauma. The Americans who'd destroyed their city were now everywhere, controlling things, providing aid, rebuilding. How were they supposed to feel about that? Some survivors developed deep hatred for Americans. Others recognized that war is complicated, that individual soldiers and aid workers weren't responsible for the decision to drop the bomb. But the emotional reality was messy and contradictory. In school, these children sat next to classmates who hadn't experienced the bombing. They felt isolated, different. How could they explain to other kids what they'd been through? Teachers often didn't know how to handle survivor children. Some were given special consideration. Others were expected to just carry on normally, which was impossible. Sachiko remembers feeling disconnected from her peers. They talked about normal things, games, friendships, small problems. She couldn't relate. She'd seen people burn to death. She'd thought her father was dead. How was she supposed to care about a spelling test? This disconnect is common among trauma survivors, especially children. They mature too quickly in some ways, while remaining frozen in their trauma in others. As these children became teenagers, they faced questions about their future. Should they stay in Nagasaki? Many families left the city, unable to bear living where such horror had occurred, but others stayed. It was their home, despite everything. The city was rebuilt. By the 1950s and 60s, Nagasaki was recovering physically. New buildings, new industries, life returning. But for those who remembered August 9th, 1945, the ghosts remained. Sumiteru would walk streets where new houses stood and remember what had been there before. He'd see a park and remember it as a pile of rubble filled with bodies. The geography was the same, but it was overlaid with memories of horror. This is part of why many survivors eventually chose to share their stories. They felt a responsibility to bear witness, to make sure the world knew what happened, to prevent it from happening again. Children who'd been silent for decades began speaking publicly about their experiences in the 1970s and 80s. They gave interviews, wrote memoirs, visited schools to talk to students. This wasn't easy. Reliving the trauma was painful, but they felt it was necessary. Yoshiro became one of these witnesses. As an older man, he traveled to schools across Japan, sharing his story with students. He wanted young people to understand the reality of nuclear weapons. Not abstract concepts, not statistics, but the lived experience of a child caught in a nuclear attack. These testimonies are incredibly valuable historical documents, but they also served a psychological purpose for the survivors. Speaking the truth, being heard, having their suffering acknowledged, this had healing power. However, not all survivors chose to speak. Many took their stories to the grave. The pain was too great, or they didn't want to be defined by their trauma, or they feared judgment and stigma. We'll never know the full extent of what these children experienced, because so many never told their stories. The children of Nagasaki became subjects of long-term medical study. The Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, later the Radiation Effects Research Foundation, tracked survivors for decades. They documented cancer rates, birth defects, growth abnormalities, and other health effects. This research was valuable scientifically. It's the basis for much of what we know about radiation's effects on humans. But for the survivors, being research subjects was complicated. They needed medical care, which the research programs provided. But they also felt like guinea pigs, specimens being studied rather than people being helped. Children who survived were examined regularly throughout their lives. Their health problems were documented. Their children were studied to look for genetic effects. Some appreciated the medical monitoring. Others resented it. Sachiko participated in these studies as she grew up. She understood the scientific value, but hated being reminded constantly of her exposure. Every checkup was a reminder of that day, of what had been done to her. The research revealed some important findings. Children who were very young at the time of exposure had higher rates of certain cancers later in life. The younger you were, the more vulnerable your rapidly dividing cells were to radiation damage. Mental and psychological development was affected in some children, especially those who suffered severe malnutrition in the aftermath or who experienced extreme trauma. Growth was stunted in some children due to radiation exposure, combined with the poor nutrition available in post-war Japan. There were cases of intellectual disability in children who'd been exposed in utero or as infants, though this was relatively rare. The good news, if any good news can be found, is that genetic effects were less severe than initially feared. The children of survivors didn't show the massive increases in birth defects that some scientists predicted, but the cancer risk was real and significant. Many child survivors developed leukemia in their teens or 20s. Others got solid cancers later in life at rates far exceeding the general population. Yoshiro developed thyroid cancer in his 40s. He survived it, but it was a direct result of radiation exposure at age 8. The medical legacy of the bombing continued throughout these children's lives. And beyond the physical effects, researchers began documenting the psychological impact. What we now call PTSD was rampant among survivors, though it wasn't called that at the time. Depression, anxiety, survivors' guilt, these were common. Rates of suicide among survivors were elevated, especially in the first few decades after the bombing. Some child survivors took their own lives as young adults, unable to cope with the trauma, the health problems, the stigma, the memories. This is part of the death toll that's not usually counted in the statistics. The bombing killed people immediately, through radiation sickness, through cancer decades later, and through trauma-induced suicide. The true number of deaths attributable to the atomic bomb is impossible to calculate precisely. In their later years, many survivors of Nagasaki have spoken about what they want the world to understand. The children who lived through it have aged into elderly people now, carrying their memories forward. Their message is remarkably consistent. First, they want people to understand that war and nuclear weapons affect real individuals, not statistics, not military targets, real children with families, dreams, and futures. When you read 70,000 people died in Nagasaki, they want you to understand that 70,000 individual stories, people who had names, personalities, loved ones. Sumiteru, speaking in his 80s, emphasized this. I was not a casualty. I was a 12-year-old boy with a name, with friends, with a family. When you forget that, when you think only in numbers, it becomes too easy to do this again. Second, they want people to understand that the effects don't end when the explosion ends. The bomb keeps killing through radiation, through trauma, through the ripple effects on families and communities. Emiko, now an elderly woman, talks about how the bombing affected her entire life, her relationships, her health, her mental state, her choices. It didn't just happen that day, she says. It's still happening. I still live in the aftermath. Third, They want nuclear weapons abolished. This is almost universal among the child survivors. They've lived the reality of nuclear warfare, and they're unanimous. These weapons must never be used again. They don't focus much on who was right or wrong in the war, on whether the bombing was justified militarily. They focus on the human cost and the reality that nuclear weapons are fundamentally different from conventional weapons. You can't use them without creating massive civilian casualties. You can't use them without leaving a legacy of radiation that affects generations. Yoshiro dedicated much of his later life to anti-nuclear activism. He spoke at the United Nations. He met with politicians. He shared his story with anyone who would listen. His message was simple. I was 8 years old. I did nothing to deserve what happened to me. No child should ever experience this. The only way to ensure they don't is to eliminate these weapons entirely. Fourth, they want acknowledgement of their suffering. For many years, survivors felt forgotten or ignored. The Japanese government didn't provide much support initially. The American government never officially apologized. Individual survivors don't necessarily demand an apology at this point, but they want their experience acknowledged as real, as horrific, as worthy of being remembered. They want their pain to mean something, to serve as a warning, to contribute to peace. Sachiko, speaking in her 70s, said, "If my suffering, if what happened to me and my family, can prevent even one future nuclear attack, then maybe it wasn't entirely meaningless." That's what I tell myself. Finally, they want people to imagine. Imagine if it was your city, your family, your child playing in the street when the flash came. They want people to feel the reality emotionally, not just understand it intellectually. Because when you can imagine your own child as Emiko or Yoshiro or Sumiteru, you understand viscerally why nuclear weapons must never be used again. So what do we take from these stories today, more than 75 years after the bombing? First, the obvious lesson about nuclear weapons. We currently have enough nuclear weapons to destroy civilization many times over. The threat hasn't disappeared. If anything, it's grown. More countries have nuclear weapons now than in 1945. The technology has spread, the weapons have gotten more powerful, and we've come frighteningly close to nuclear war several times since 1945. The Cuban Missile Crisis, false alarms during the Cold War, tensions between nuclear-armed nations. We've been lucky. That's really what it comes down to. We've been lucky that no one has used these weapons again in warfare, but the children of Nagasaki remind us that luck runs out. Second, there's a lesson about the cost of war on children specifically. In every conflict, children suffer disproportionately. They're the most vulnerable. They have no say in the decisions that lead to war, but bear the consequences. Whether it's Nagasaki in 1945 or conflicts today, children experience trauma that shapes their entire lives. We have a responsibility to consider this when we make decisions about military action, about conflict, about how we resolve international disputes. Third, there's a lesson about memory and witness. The survivors who chose to tell their stories performed an invaluable service. They kept the reality of nuclear weapons alive in our collective consciousness. Without their testimonies, nuclear weapons would remain abstract, numbers on a page, strategic considerations. Their stories make it real. They force us to confront the human cost. As the last survivors age and pass away, it becomes our responsibility to carry these stories forward, to make sure new generations understand what happened, not to assign blame or rehash old arguments about whether the bombing was justified, but to ensure the reality of nuclear weapons remains vivid and real. Fourth, there's a lesson about resilience. The children of Nagasaki survived incomprehensible horror. Many went on to live full lives. They loved, worked, raised families, found joy despite their trauma. This doesn't diminish their suffering, but it shows the remarkable resilience of the human spirit, particularly in children. Yoshiro lost his entire family, lived in an orphanage, struggled with trauma his whole life, but he also experienced love, friendship, purpose. He contributed to peace movements. He helped educate people. His life was marked by tragedy, but not defined solely by it. This is something the survivors often emphasize. Yes, they suffered. Yes, they were traumatized. But they were also full human beings who lived complex lives. Finally, there's a lesson about our common humanity. The children of Nagasaki were just children. Like children everywhere, they played, laughed, worried about ordinary things. They weren't enemy combatants. They weren't responsible for their country's war decisions. They were 8-year-olds kicking a ball, 6-year-olds playing with dolls, 12-year-olds working in factories because war had disrupted normal life. When we read their stories, we should see our own children, our neighbors' children, children we know. That recognition of common humanity is the beginning of a commitment to peace. Let me give you a bit more detail about what happened to some of the individuals we've been following. Sachiko's family struggled in the years after the bombing. Her father's injuries prevented him from returning to his old job. They faced severe financial hardship, but they stayed together, which in itself was a triumph. Sachiko became a teacher. She married, though not without facing discrimination from her husband's family because of her survivor status. She had children and worried constantly about potential health effects from her radiation exposure, though her children were healthy. In her 60s, she began speaking publicly about her experiences. She visited schools, sharing her story with students who were the same age she'd been when the bomb fell. She said it was healing, finally, to speak the truth after decades of silence. She lived into her 80s, dying of natural causes unrelated to her radiation exposure. Before she died, she recorded a detailed oral history, wanting her full story preserved. Sumiteru's life was harder. After losing his parents and eventually his sister, he struggled to find his place in the world. He worked various jobs, never settling into a career. He battled depression and alcoholism. The trauma of what he'd witnessed, particularly having to leave that boy trapped under the beam, haunted him. But in his 50s, he connected with other survivors and found a community of people who understood. He became active in survivor organizations, advocating for better support and for nuclear disarmament. He never married, never had children. He said he couldn't bear the thought of bringing children into a world where what happened to him could happen again. He died in his 70s from cancer, likely related to his radiation exposure. Emiko's path was different. Being so young when the bombing occurred, her memories were less vivid, which was both a blessing and a curse. She didn't carry the same detailed traumatic memories as older survivors. But she grew up in the shadow of her grandmother's death and her father's absence. Her mother never fully recovered emotionally, and Emiko became her caretaker from a young age. She trained as a nurse, saying she wanted to help people the way she wished someone could have helped her grandmother. She married a man who was also a survivor, though from Hiroshima. They understood each other's trauma in a way non-survivors couldn't. They had 2 children and lived a quiet life in Nagasaki, never leaving the city despite its ghosts. Emiko participated in the medical studies, believing it was important for science to understand the effects of radiation. She developed breast cancer in her 50s but survived it. Now in her 80s, she still lives in Nagasaki. She visits the Peace Park regularly, honoring her grandmother and all those who died. Yoshiro's life took many turns. After leaving the orphanage at 16, he worked odd jobs, always feeling disconnected from normal society. He married young but divorced, had a daughter he struggled to connect with emotionally. In his 40s, he had a breakdown. The trauma he'd buried for decades came flooding back. He attempted suicide, but survived. That crisis became a turning point. He entered therapy and began, for the first time, processing what had happened to him. He reconnected with his daughter, started speaking publicly about his experiences, became passionate about education and peace advocacy. He remarried in his 60s to a woman who supported his activism. They traveled together, sharing his story internationally. He wrote a memoir detailing his experiences as a child survivor. It became required reading in many Japanese schools. He lived to see his grandchildren, which brought him joy and also pain, joy in their existence, pain in remembering himself at their age, experiencing the bombing. He died peacefully in his sleep at 82, having found some measure of peace with his past. Let's talk a bit more about the physical reality these children experienced, because the details matter. The temperature at ground zero reached several thousand degrees Celsius. People within a kilometer of the hypocenter were vaporized or burned beyond recognition instantly. Children playing in the Urakami Valley simply ceased to exist. Their shadows, burned into walls, were sometimes the only evidence they'd been there. Slightly further out, children experienced flash burns. The thermal radiation burned exposed skin facing the blast. Many children had patterns burned onto their skin, the pattern of their clothing, for instance. The fabric provided minimal shielding, creating bizarre burn patterns. Some children were burned on one side of their body, but not the other, depending on which way they were facing. The blast wave that followed milliseconds after the flash traveled at supersonic speed initially, then slowed to about 700 miles per hour. This wind was strong enough to throw children through the air like leaves. Buildings collapsed on top of children who were inside. Thousands were trapped in the rubble. Those who could move heard children screaming from under collapsed houses. The sounds of children calling for help, crying in pain, begging to be rescued. And in many cases, there was nothing anyone could do. The rubble was too heavy, too much debris, too many people needing help. Rescuers had to make horrible choices about who to try to save. The fires started almost immediately. The thermal radiation ignited anything flammable. Curtains, wooden buildings, paper, clothing on people's bodies. Children ran with their clothes on fire, jumped into water tanks to extinguish the flames, sometimes drowning in the process. The smell of burning flesh filled the air. Children who survived described this smell as the worst part. It got into your nose, your throat. You couldn't escape it. For weeks afterward, the smell of death and decay hung over the city. Bodies were everywhere, rotting in the August heat. Children had to walk past corpses, over corpses, around corpses. Some bodies were piled up for mass cremation. Children saw adults they might have known burning in these piles. The water sources became contaminated. Wells were filled with debris and bodies. Rivers were clogged with the dead. Children drank contaminated water because there was no alternative. This spread disease and added to the radiation exposure. The black rain that fell contained not just radioactive particles, but also ash from burned buildings and burned bodies. When children were covered in this rain, they were literally covered in the remains of the city and its people. Many children developed severe diarrhea and dysentery from contaminated water and food. This was dangerous when medical care was unavailable and food was scarce. The starvation that followed the bombing was its own horror. Children went days with little or no food. Their bodies, already stressed by radiation and injuries, were further weakened by malnutrition. Some children resorted to eating anything they could find. Unripe fruit, plants that might be poisonous, food from the wreckage that was contaminated or spoiled. Parents gave their small food rations to their children, going hungry themselves. Children watched their parents waste away, knowing they were sacrificing for them. The psychological impact on these children cannot be overstated. Imagine being a child who watched your sibling die, your parent die, your friends die. Imagine seeing people burning alive and being unable to help them. Imagine the guilt of surviving when others didn't. Many children developed what's called survivor's guilt. They asked themselves, why did I live when my friend died? Why was I in a place that was shielded when someone else wasn't? What did I do to deserve to survive? This guilt was irrational, but it was powerful. Some children developed obsessive behaviors, constantly checking on family members to make sure they were still alive, refusing to let parents out of their sight. Others developed the opposite response, emotional detachment. They couldn't afford to get close to people because everyone could be taken away in an instant. Nightmares were nearly universal. The flash, the fires, the screaming. These images replayed in children's minds every night. Many developed insomnia, afraid to sleep because of the nightmares. During the day, loud noises could trigger panic attacks. A car backfiring, thunder, anything that sounded like an explosion. Bright lights could cause flashbacks. A sunny day reflecting off a window could trigger memories of the flash. Some children became hypervigilant, always scanning for danger, unable to relax. Others became withdrawn, depressed, uninterested in activities they'd once enjoyed. School became difficult for many survivor children. How could they concentrate on lessons when their minds were full of trauma? Teachers sometimes didn't understand. They expected children to just carry on normally. This was the cultural expectation in post-war Japan. Endure, don't complain, move forward. But trauma doesn't work that way. Children who couldn't keep up in school fell behind. Some dropped out. This limited their future opportunities, creating a cycle where trauma led to educational failure, which led to economic hardship. Relationships were difficult. Children who'd experienced the bomb often felt they couldn't relate to peers who hadn't. They might be playing a game and suddenly have a flashback. Their friends wouldn't understand why they suddenly became upset or withdrawn. Dating and relationships as teenagers and young adults were complicated by their survivor status. The stigma, the health concerns, the psychological wounds. Many survivors report feeling like they aged decades in a single day. They'd seen things that changed them fundamentally. They could never be innocent children again. This premature maturation came with costs. They missed out on normal childhood experiences, normal teenage experiences. Some survivors became very serious, focused people. Others struggled to find any purpose or direction. Depression was common and often untreated. Mental health care in post-war Japan was limited, and there was stigma around seeking help. Suicide rates among survivors, particularly young adult survivors, were elevated. Some survivors turned to alcohol or other substances to numb the pain and the memories. The trauma was passed down to the next generation in some cases. Children of survivors sometimes grew up in households marked by their parents' unprocessed trauma. But it's important to note that many survivors showed remarkable resilience. They built lives, found joy, contributed to their communities. The human capacity to heal, even from profound trauma, is real. But it's also true that the wounds never fully disappeared. Even survivors who lived full, successful lives carried the scars. It's important to understand Nagasaki in the broader context of World War II and its aftermath. Japan had been at war since 1931 when it invaded Manchuria. For children born in the mid-1930s, war was all they'd really known. By 1945, Japanese cities were being devastated by conventional firebombing. Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, and many others had experienced massive destruction and civilian casualties. The firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945 killed an estimated 100,000 people in a single night. Children across Japan had been experiencing air raids, destruction, death. So the children of Nagasaki were already living in a war zone before the atomic bomb. They'd already experienced air raid sirens, food shortages, fear. This context is important because it shows that the trauma wasn't starting from zero. These children were already stressed, already afraid, already dealing with the psychological impact of war. The atomic bomb was a quantum leap in destructive power, but it wasn't the introduction of suffering to these children's lives. After the war ended on August 15, 1945, Japan faced massive challenges. The entire country had to be rebuilt, the economy was shattered, millions of soldiers needed to be reintegrated. Cities were in ruins. The American occupation brought both relief and resentment. Aid was welcome, but occupation was difficult to accept. For children of Nagasaki, seeing American soldiers in their city was psychologically complex. These were the people whose country had dropped the bomb, but they were also individuals, some of whom were kind and helpful. Learning to separate individual Americans from the institutional decision to use the bomb was a psychological challenge for many survivors. The Cold War that followed meant that nuclear weapons proliferated rather than being banned. The US and Soviet Union built massive arsenals. For Nagasaki survivors, watching the nuclear arms race was traumatic. The very weapons that had destroyed their city were being built by the thousands. They felt like their suffering had taught the world nothing. This motivated many to become peace activists, but it also created a sense of despair. Would humanity really risk using these weapons again? Nagasaki has become a city of remembrance. The Peace Park, built near the Hypo Center, serves as a memorial and a statement of commitment to peace. Every year on August 9th, there's a ceremony. Survivors gather. The mayor gives a speech. There's a moment of silence at 11:02 a.m., the exact moment of the bombing. For the children who survived and grew old, these ceremonies are important. They're a public acknowledgement of what happened. A communal act of remembering, but they're also painful, every year returning to that date, that time, those memories. The Peace Museum in Nagasaki tells the story of the bombing through artifacts, testimonies, and exhibits. It's unflinching in its depiction of the horror. Children's belongings are displayed. A charred lunchbox, a burned school uniform, a melted bottle. These objects make the reality tangible in a way statistics cannot. The museum also provides historical context and promotes the message of peace and nuclear disarmament. School groups visit the museum, and survivors sometimes speak to them, sharing their experiences directly. This intergenerational transmission of memory is crucial. The survivors are now very elderly. Soon, there will be no one left who directly experienced the bombing. The responsibility for remembering will fall entirely to subsequent generations. Monuments and markers throughout Nagasaki identify significant sites, where schools stood, where neighborhoods were, where specific events occurred during the bombing and its aftermath. Walking through Nagasaki today, you can see a modern, thriving city. But these markers remind you that beneath the present, the past remains. For survivor children who stayed in Nagasaki or returned, this landscape of memory is their daily reality. They shop in stores built where their childhood homes stood. They drive past the site where they saw horrors. The city is both familiar and forever changed. International visitors come to Nagasaki to learn about the bombing. The city has become a pilgrimage site for peace activists and for anyone seeking to understand nuclear weapons reality. Survivors, when they were younger, often served as guides or speakers for these visitors, sharing their stories with people from around the world. Now, as the survivors age and pass away, the city is working to preserve their testimonies through recordings, written accounts, and digital archives. There's a recognition that we're approaching the end of the era when direct witnesses to the atomic bombings are alive. The children of Nagasaki experienced something no children should ever experience. They lived through the use of a weapon that changed warfare forever. They survived when many didn't and carried the weight of that survival for the rest of their lives. They faced discrimination, health problems, psychological trauma, and the challenge of building lives from the ruins of their childhoods, but they also showed remarkable strength. They raised families, they contributed to their communities, they worked for peace. Many dedicated their later years to education, to bearing witness, to making sure the world never forgot what happened on August 9th, 1945. Their message is simple but profound. This must never happen again. Nuclear weapons are not abstract strategic tools. They are instruments of mass death that kill indiscriminately, that cause suffering that extends for decades, that traumatize generations. As we face a world where nuclear weapons still exist, where tensions between nuclear-armed nations flare, where the possibility of nuclear war remains real, the voices of Nagasaki's children echo across the decades. Listen to them. Hear their stories not as history, but as warning. Understand that every nuclear weapon in existence represents the potential for thousands of children to experience what Sachiko, Sumiteru, Emiko, and Yoshiro experienced. That's why these stories matter. Not to assign blame for past decisions, historians and ethicists will continue debating the justification of the bombings, but to understand viscerally, emotionally, what nuclear weapons do. To recognize that the people affected are not statistics, but individuals with names, stories, families. To commit ourselves to ensuring no more children ever have to be survivors of nuclear warfare. The children of Nagasaki are aging now. Soon they'll all be gone. But their testimonies remain. Their words, their warnings. We have a responsibility to listen, to remember, and to act on what they've taught us. Because the alternative, forgetting, becoming complacent, allowing nuclear weapons to proliferate unchecked, risks creating new generations of children who will experience what the children of Nagasaki experienced. And that's something the survivors have spent their lives trying to prevent. Their suffering should mean something, should serve as a barrier against future use of these weapons. That's what they want. That's their legacy. The question is, will we honor it? So what can you do with this information? First, share these stories. Talk about them. When nuclear weapons come up in conversation or in the news, bring the human element into the discussion. It's easy to talk about nuclear weapons abstractly. Megaton yields. Strategic deterrence. Military targets. It's harder but more important to talk about children playing in gardens, children working in factories, children whose lives were destroyed in an instant. Second, educate yourself further. This video only scratches the surface. There are books, documentaries, museum exhibits, and survivor testimonies available. The more you understand about what actually happened in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, the more equipped you are to speak knowledgeably about nuclear weapons. Third, support organizations working for nuclear disarmament. There are many credible groups working to reduce nuclear stockpiles and prevent proliferation. Whether through donations, volunteering, or simply learning about their work, you can contribute to this effort. Fourth, hold leaders accountable. When politicians discuss nuclear weapons policy, pay attention, ask questions, demand that they consider the human costs, not just strategic advantages. Democracy requires informed, engaged citizens. Be one. Finally, remember, just remember. Remember the children of Nagasaki. Remember that nuclear weapons are not theoretical. Remember that war has real victims, that children always suffer most, that the decisions we make about weapons and conflict have profound human consequences. If you found this video valuable, please like it, share it, and subscribe to the channel. I create content about history's human stories, and your support helps me continue this work. Leave a comment below about what struck you most in these stories or what you think we should learn from them. And most importantly, don't let this be just another video you watch and forget. Let it change how you think about nuclear weapons, about war, about the value of peace. The children of Nagasaki can't speak for themselves much longer. We have to speak for them. Thank you for watching.